Thank you, Kevin. Thanks, everyone, for joining us this morning. I thought it was less than 5 years ago when Kevin was last with us as well. It didn't seem that long ago, but I invite you to turn back your mind 5 years and think about how much has changed in that time frame. 5 years ago in our industry, I don't want to say we were riding high because we haven't been riding high to that degree for a while, but we did not have the regulatory threats that we have now. We had President Trump in office, and we talked more and more about the economic and regulatory threats that we faced. We talked more about the economic threats than the regulatory threats that we faced. The market pressures were turning against us due to cheap gas and continued downward pressure on renewables through subsidies and other mechanisms. And so to see how much has changed in 5 years, number one, we went through this whole pandemic that it was unimaginable in 2018, the response to that, and still digging out of many aspects of that. And then you come back to a point where maybe the market pressures are starting to be surmountable, and then you run into what we're calling the regulatory train wreck. And as I make my brief welcome today, I wanted to just encapsulate what we are facing as an industry in this regulatory train wreck. Again, contrast it to 5 years ago. Think about what has changed, what we were dealing with then to what we're dealing with now, the threats that are facing our industry and impacting our ability to plan long-term due to the regulatory threats that our own government is imposing upon us. The first among these is mercury rules. Mercury has been one of those issues that is specific to North Dakota Lignite and how our responses have to be developed. We're unique in the country in the chemical composition of lignite, which means that all of the work that is done across the country on mercury doesn't necessarily apply to how we can burn lignite in our power plants. Furthermore, we're under even more scrutiny from the federal government as they look to fine-tune regulations on mercury, not to do any beneficial public health reason, but specifically to put the lignite industry in North Dakota out of business. They've done so by targeting what is referred to as the lignite subcategory, which is specifically carved out due to the proven chemical characteristics of North Dakota lignite coal. This has been recognized by EPA for decades, and what they've chosen to do is eliminate the existence of that subcategory and require that North Dakota's power plants operate under the same mercury regulations as power plants across the country, despite the well-known and proven chemical differences in our coal. It's a perfect example of how the EPA has approached the industry not as a partner, not as a problem solver, but as the angel of death come to impose its will upon us in a way that is not fair or reasoned or even consistent with the science that has been developed for decades, that the agency itself has admitted is the appropriate interpretation. But that's just one. After mercury, there's the carbon rule. Once again, the administration has imposed an unworkable carbon rule on us. We went through this with the Clean Power Plan, where the same assumptions, wrapped very differently, are being made today than were made in 2016, 2015, when we were fighting the Clean Power Plan. And those assumptions are that the industry has greatly more advanced technology than we actually have, and that the timeline can be drastically accelerated than what is actually possible. This is despite the fact that even going back for 10, 15 years, the Department of Energy itself has worked on a timeline which would commercialize carbon capture technology well beyond where the EPA believes it should set the threshold. This malalignment between the EPA and the DOE ought to be getting more press, because the Department of Energy ought to be the scientific and technical experts on the state of technologies that they themselves fund and help develop. But once again, we find that the EPA ignores or does not even solicit the advice of the Department of Energy when it is putting together our carbon capture rules, that it then disperses to us, the folks who have to live with these unworkable regulations. So that's regulation 2, that is a significant threat to the industry. After MATS, after the carbon rule, you still have to deal with regional haze, which is a visibility rule that could require us to shut down power plants for no increase in visibility. This is such a great year to talk about regional haze, because how many days this summer have you not been able to see across town? And how many of those days did it have anything at all to do with human activity in North Dakota? Every cloudy, hazy day, or every hazy day we've had this summer when visibility was impaired in Bismarck or at Theodore Roosevelt Park, the visibility was impaired because of wildfires, usually not even within our own country. Once again, do the regulatory agencies take into effect the real reason for impaired visibility? They absolutely don't. So once again, another regulatory impact that we're facing down that is devoid of any scientific basis. A visibility rule where visibility impairment is not really taken into account. We still are dealing with things like waters of the United States, with coal combustion residuals, and those other regulatory issues where BLM is doing their own resource planning on public lands and trying to change the definition of multiple use words like recreation. It's a train wreck that we haven't faced for many years. And it's not just in the federal agencies. We're also dealing in the state of Minnesota with the Minnesota Carbon-Free Law, which would require electrons to only go to Minnesota if they're green, as if the electrons can choose where they want to go. But the policy making in Minnesota maybe isn't as disjointed from reality as the regulatory regime in Washington, D.C., but it is just as disjointed from the physics of a grid and the inability to make those electrons do what the policymakers in Minnesota want to command them to do. It's unfortunate because whether you're talking about the federal agencies, the state of Minnesota, or any interested observer in the country, we remain the leaders in carbon capture development and technology and deployment. We're actually doing the things that these people talk about in their spare time. How can we reduce carbon emissions? Well, if they were truly interested with it, instead of looking at North Dakota's industry with an eye to squashing it, they would look at North Dakota's industry with an eye toward learning and expanding upon the lessons that we've been building here for 20 years on carbon capture, on energy development, sustainability, those words that they use but don't understand the meaning of. It's a frustrating time to be in the industry, but at the same time, I have to say it's also an optimistic time to be in the industry. You'll hear some of this today, where we are making inroads with, for instance, the regional transmission organizations. The inroads might be this big right now, but for the first time, MISO and SPP submitted comments to the EPA, taking them to task for the impact, the cumulative impact of the rules they're passing on grid stability and security. This is a big deal because for the first time, these RTOs might be taking a step back and saying, are we creating a problem that is going to have real consequences for consumers in this country? And I think finally they're going to take a better look at valuing the types of resource attributes that people actually value. People value resilience, availability. They do value sustainability, but they value sustainability the way that North Dakota values sustainability, as a holistic, comprehensive approach to humans, the environment, and our communities. I think the RTOs might be opening their eyes just a little bit. So I'm excited for this conference because we get to talk about those things, as well as some of the exciting things that we have touched about in the past, continued development and promise in things like critical minerals. One thing that the conflict in Ukraine and elsewhere has taught us is that we have to be aware of the critical nature of domestic supply of critical materials. It's not just minerals, it's energy itself. It's other components that if we don't be aware of how we source those things, our whole lives could shut down. And you all see it in your daily lives when, whether it is a supply chain crunch in your business or the price of eggs going to like $15 a dozen. You see the problems when we don't have adequate supply and we don't have an adequate supply chain. Those things are trickling into the energy world. So I'd like to just kind of preview those topics that we're going to cover today and welcome you all to our conference. I really appreciate you all coming. I want to thank our staff at the Lignite Energy Council for doing such a great job of putting this together. We had a board meeting yesterday that was all hands on deck for our staff. Again, they did a great job, and I appreciate them, and I want to give them all, for yesterday and today, a round of applause for their work in putting this conference together. Before we get started, I also just wanted to mention something I think that we all see in the news the past couple days, and Senator Doug Larson passed away in a plane accident in southern Utah, and he was a friend to the industry. And I just would ask you sometime when you have a private moment today, if you would take a moment of prayer for those that he left behind. If you look on his Facebook page, the magnitude of what happens will truly hit you. To see the pictures of his family, the friends, everyone that he left behind. And so again, if you have a private moment today, I would just ask if you would do that for those people that he left behind. And with that, I want to make sure that I make myself available if you have any questions for today. If you need anything, please flag down me, any of our staff, and we'll try and make it happen for you. Once again, thank you very much for your attendance today. We're going to take a short break while we get Julie up to speed and ready to speak, and then she'll talk more in depth about the challenges that she's seeing in the world of the RTOs. Thank you for being here.